welcome back. For our next conversation, I have been joined in studio by Dr. Colin Young. He's the Executive Director of the 5Cs. And we're going to be discussing a milestone that has been achieved by the 5Cs in Belize. 20 years of climate leadership within the region. Good morning, Doc.
Good morning, and thanks for having me, Sani.
Let's look back at the genesis of the 5Cs and how it established itself in Belize to discuss matters of environment, matters of climate resilience, and what have you, and how we got to our 20th anniversary.
So the 5Cs, the idea of a Caribbean Community Climate Change Center became quite apparent in the early 2000s when there were projects that were being implemented in the region by the World Bank and the Global Environmental Facility. And during the implementation of those projects, it became very clear that the piecemeal project by project approach would not have the kind of sustained impact that we wanted to see in the region. And so out of one of these projects, the idea of a regional center to coordinate climate change response in the region was born. And so they set up a task force comprised of persons from across the Caribbean, including persons from Belize. Now Ambassador Carlos Fuller from Belize was a part of that task force. And that task force essentially helped develop what would then become the 5Cs. And it was taken to what we call the COTED, which is a Ministers of Environment of the Caribbean meeting, where the idea of the 5Cs was born. And then in 2002, right here in Belize, CARICOM heads of government at the 13th intersessional meeting, they would set up and approve the agreement establishing the center. At the time, you had the Right Honorable Prime Minister Said Musa, who was the Prime Minister of Belize at the time, and you had the current Prime Minister of Belize, Honorable Johnny Briceño, who was the Minister of Natural Resources at the time. And they were both successful in convincing their counterparts, the other heads of government in the region, that Belize should be the location and the host of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. And so that is how there were 4 countries that bid to host the center. The last 2 countries were Barbados and Belize. And Honorable Prime Minister Said Musa, at a meeting with the Barbados Prime Minister, had a bilateral, and out of that meeting, when they came out, Belize secured the host country of the 5Cs. And so in February of 2002, the agreement establishing the 5Cs as a CARICOM institution was signed. And it had a very simple mandate: coordinate the region's response to climate change. So even then, the heads of government recognized that climate change is one of the greatest threats to the survival of small island developing states. So they were quite visionary. They were also quite bold, because even though they set up the 5Cs to coordinate the region's response to climate change, one of the interesting things about the 5Cs, it was the first CARICOM institution that was set up to be self-financed. In other words, you had this important work to do, but you had to find the money on your own to run its operations.
Looking back over the 20 years, and you've alluded to this, that putting this together was quite visionary in terms of forecasting or foreseeing what would be an issue that the rest of the world is also grappling with. But my question, Doc, is that there is so much buzz around climate change and the real effects that we're experiencing, not only as a region, but globally. But when you go to various fora to discuss climate change and the need for financing to address it properly, it comes off, my opinion, as a lot of talk shop, and there is little action where actually putting your money is concerned. What are your thoughts?
I would agree. I would want to agree with you, Isani, that for those standing on the outside, looking in, you would absolutely come to that conclusion that it is in fact a lot of talk shop. And while there are important decisions that are made at these gatherings and at these conferences, our ability to follow up and deliver on even the little that we agree on has always been a difficult undertaking. But I think we need to take a step back and ask the question, if multilateralism isn't the answer, then what is? Right? And so when you have 195 countries in the world all trying to meet at a meeting and agree on what are the priorities that we should pursue, putting aside national interests, putting aside current economic situations, putting aside various geopolitical pressures, how do you navigate that landscape? And I think as small island developing states and low-lying coastal states like Belize and small countries like St. Kitts and Nevis with only 75,000 people, going it alone in the international space is not the answer. Collectively and as a region, as CARICOM, we stand a much better chance when we are united. When all of the small island developing states across the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Caribbean unite together, we have a collective voice that is greater than each individual country. And so we continue to, despite our disappointments, despite the fact that developed countries, those who are most responsible for causing human anthropogenic climate change, despite the fact that they're not delivering on their promise of providing more money, more technology, and more capacity building, the truth is that some traction has been made and some progress has been made, albeit not at the rate that we would want. And so I come back to the point that as slow and as fragmented as the current process is at the moment, unfortunately, there is not another better alternative that exists. And so we must continue. We must be a part of the process. We have to be at the table. We have to amplify our voices while we continue to do what we can to help protect our people and lives and livelihoods.
What is, in a sense, disheartening when you look at the universal picture is the fact that small island developing states aren't necessarily the culprits in all of this, right? We're way too small. If you look at it as a percentage, we're way too small to be the primary emitters, right? But we are the ones who feel it the most. When you think of erosion, when you think of devastating natural disasters, right? We're in the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. Goes all the way through to November 31st or whatever it is, last day in November. But it's no longer a time where we could say, you know what? If a storm comes our way, it might not be as dreadful as it would be now based on all of these factors that are coming to play. When you go before these other world leaders and these change agents and what have you, what is the pitch? Because at the end of the day, we come from small island developing states, as SID stands for. What is the pitch to convince them to do more?
The pitch has always been to share the lived experiences and to show the suffering of our people and the loss of lives and livelihoods. When you look at, for example, what Hurricane Maria would have done to countries in the Caribbean, like Dominica, that in a few hours destroyed the equivalent of 226% of its GDP. And the impact that would have on the sustainable development aspirations of its people, where critical infrastructure, hospitals, schools, energy systems, all destroyed within a few hours. And the years it would take just to get back to pre-hurricane GDP. Not to mention that in those periods you'll have storms, perhaps more hurricanes. Belize has had its share. We've had hurricane, for example, Hurricane Hattie, which a lot of persons might remember. But Category 5 hurricanes are now becoming more frequent.
Exactly.
They're becoming, and they get stronger very, very quickly. So there was once upon a time, you know, hurricanes, you heard them, they were coming, and you had time. You just saw the one that hit Mexico just last week, got from a category 1 to a category 4 in the matter of hours. And so it gives people very little time. So when you go in front of these larger world leaders, sometimes a picture is worth more than 1,000 words. However, with the geopolitics changing, the narrative has to also change. So not only are we saying it's an it's an injustice, the fact that you are responsible for the suffering and the losses and damages that we are experiencing, and so it has to be fixed from a moral, strategic standpoint. But we're also seeing the effects that climate change has on the movement and displacement of people, and the so-called climate refugees. And so now speaking that language of how Europe, of how the US, and how if you don't do enough to cut emissions, to slow down climate change, then people are going to move. And when people move, it's going to become a national security issue, because now you'll have migrants moving in large numbers because they can't grow food to feed their families, and they've lost every single thing because of the disasters that they're experiencing. So I think a combination of showing the link between things like immigration, about the issues around poverty, and where there's a lot of poverty, there is economic instability, and also in terms of the suffering of the most vulnerable in the world, women, children, people with disabilities, the elderly, and then obviously the economic impacts that it's having. It's a whole narrative that we need to continue to tell and continue to show these stories. And by doing so, we get to stimulate the kind of action. But Isani, we have to be real. There are powerful countries in the world, there are powerful persons in the world who are spending a lot of money trying to convince the world that climate change is
a figment of the imagination.
Is a figment of the imagination. Yeah. And with the advent of social media, you know, there's a counter narrative. There's a counter narrative out there that that confuses people. It sort of, if it fits within your worldview and your ideology, you tend to want to believe it, and you sort of lock everything else out. And so we must also become quite savvy without being overly academic and overly bureaucratic, to speak in very simple ways to have people understand what we're trying to convey. That by protecting the most vulnerable among us, everybody benefits, everybody wins. And we can help to slow some of the suffering that we're seeing from these increased climate-related events.
Doc, 20 years later, does the 5Cs have complete buy-in from all the countries within the Caribbean that are part of this initiative?
Well, all the countries have signed on to the agreement establishing the center, except for a couple. And I have to give credit to all of those persons who came before, because Dr. Kenrick Leslie, the first executive director of the 5Cs, who was there from the beginning up until 2020, they did a lot of good to create the kind of ownership and buy-in of our member states across the region. And I often say, you know, today the 5Cs still plays a fundamentally important role across the region. We bring ministers together twice a year to agree on what the priorities will be for CARICOM going into these COP negotiations, the talk shops you spoke about. We continue to mobilize a significant amount of resources for our member states. To date, the 5Cs has mobilized over $250 million for countries across the region, including for Belize. We continue to build the data and information architecture to ensure that we're collecting and analyzing and using the data for evidence-based decision making. And so the 5Cs has performed, it has delivered. Not to mention that, as I said, it does not get subventions from member states. And I think I'll say this, Isani, last year there was a study done by the Oxford Development Institute that asked countries in the region who were their preferred entity that they wanted to work with to access climate finance. And there were lots of international organizations in there. There were, GIZ, UNDP, ADB, IDB, CDB, other organizations, and 5Cs was ranked at the very top. And so it is a demonstration of the work that the center has been doing. It is going to, the environment in which the 5Cs was founded in 2002, operationally it opened in 2005. And the world in 2025 is quite different. We have actually seen a significant change both in terms of the official development assistance. In fact, next year we're expecting that the 7 biggest countries that used to provide bilateral support are going to cut their support by up to 28%. We're seeing war in Europe, and we're seeing countries diverting aid that was meant for the global south to now go into defense in Europe. We're seeing increased conflict in the Middle East. We are seeing a more internal look by countries, those same countries that are responsible for causing climate change. And so our ability to navigate the changing geopolitical landscape and the changing international financial landscape is going to require even more support and ownership from our governments in the next 20 years. The 5Cs has made it this far because of its ability to form and forge strategic partnerships and its ability to engage and work with partners and to innovate and to be flexible. That is what is going to also allow it to navigate the changes that is being seen. But as a CARICOM institution, we're only as strong as the support and as the legitimacy that we get from the 15 CARICOM member states.
Doc, before we let you go, what are we doing to celebrate 20 years? I know there's an agenda for events to take place later this week.
Yes, we want to obviously thank the government of Belize who have agreed, and the Prime Minister to agree to co-host the 20th anniversary celebrations with the 5Cs. And we actually start off a couple days of events. Tomorrow, we actually have, the Prime Minister is hosting a welcome reception. We have about 50 persons coming from all over the world and from the Caribbean to join us who are instrumental in starting and founding of the 5Cs. And then on Wednesday, we have a groundbreaking ceremony in Belmopan. The Prime Minister of St. Lucia is coming. He's the quasi-cabinet lead for CARICOM for Sustainable Development, and he's joining the Honorable Prime Minister John Briceño at UB in the morning for a groundbreaking ceremony. The 5Cs is finally going to be constructing its permanent headquarters on the campus of the university. And then at 1:30 on Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon, we have a series of panel discussions at the Biltmore that looks at the pre-establishment of the 5Cs, what led to its establishment. We have a panel that will look at the first 15 years of what worked, what were the lessons, what were the successes. And then we have the third panel, which would look at the current and future trajectory of the 5Cs. And then at 6:30 on Wednesday evening, on the 25th, we are actually going to have the anniversary celebrations and a banquet, where we are also going to be issuing some awards to those persons and organizations and governments that were instrumental. So we are joined by ministers from across the Caribbean, by the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, persons from the CARICOM Secretariat, our donor partners, and regional institutions. And so what we're trying to do is to demonstrate that the experiment that the heads of government tried 20 years ago has proven to be very successful, and that the 5Cs continues to deliver exceptional value for our member states. And ultimately, Sani, we are here to assist our member states to achieve the development and climate change plans that they have. And what drives us and what drives my team and my staff is the fact that our actions, in a small way, have a very tangible and positive impact on the lives and livelihoods of about 40 million people across the region.
Expertly put. Thanks a lot for joining us this morning, Doc. We take a commercial break now, and when we return, it's our friends from FCD to close off the show.